If you don't stop eating sweets, this won't matter. You will lose your feet, or worse, if you keep eating like a white. Now, this dialogue is incredibly racist, to say the least, as well as doesn't define whether this character is type 1 diabetic at all. Now, where's this line of dialogue from? Killers of the Flower Moon. Our last focus, Molly Burkhart, and how her diabetes is talked about in the film. Let's get into it. Killers of the Flower Moon is a Western drama directed by Martin Scorsese, which focuses on King Hale and his family trying to poison and get rid of an Osage family in order to inherit their oil-rich lands. Now, Molly Burkhart, the youngest daughter of this family, is diagnosed with diabetes, which comes up multiple times within the storyline considering their attempts to try to get rid of her family. She is considered the weakest link, however, spoilers, she does survive to the very end. Now, insulin does come up in one of the scenes, with insulin coming from Toronto for Molly, basically funded by King Hale and his family in a lot of ways. And they mention that it's made from a cow's pancreas and it's highly rare and expensive. And these are historically accurate, unfortunate as they are, considering Frederick Bansing never wanted that to be the case. Throughout the scene, the doctors are almost attacking Molly in a lot of ways, asking her about her diet, making fun of her, and she has a lot of lack of autonomy in this scene, which makes sense. I mean, look at the last two films we talked about in a lot of ways and how diabetics are treated. However, there's a racial element considering she's an indigenous woman. In the second scene that we see insulin mentioned is when Ernest is inserting poison, although he doesn't understand it, that King Hale has given him to the insulin. He starts giving it to Molly, and even though we never see him administering it to her, we understand that he is poisoning this treatment. And it moves away from the doctors giving it to her to Ernest giving it to her, but then when we get to one of the final scenes, we see her giving herself insulin for the first time, where she takes responsibility for her diagnosis in a lot of ways. She's kind of stripping away that dependence on Ernest and a lot of the other people in the plot, and she's kind of taking it for herself. However, unfortunate as it is, in the epilogue that Martin Scorsese delivers, we find that she died of complications from her diagnosis at the age of 50. However, we don't know if those were complications because of diabetes or the fact her husband was putting poison in her treatment. From my personal experience watching the film, I had to pause it several times because I found myself getting very emotional watching Molly and her experience. I mean, the way that the people were treating her in the film in terms of her diagnosis, almost punishing her, looking down on her in a lot of ways, was just so emotional to me. As well as watching her waste away for many parts of the film because of the poisoning that's taking effect. Once we reached the end, I was very happy to find that she had survived all of this, but to find out that she had died from complications was such a hit to the heart, especially because there was no accountability for the wrongdoing that her husband or King Hale or any of the people had committed. Just frustrated me so much, considering just the inequality of the indigenous people in that land historically, as well as just the way that they were treating her. In a 1968 medical article, they were discussing how indigenous populations, or specifically the Navajo tribe, were considered to have higher blood sugars than their European counterparts. Now, this study never compared their findings to the European counterparts, from what I could see. And they just distilled this difference to be genetic or biological, or considered like biomarkers in a lot of ways. And I was looking at historian Arlene Tuckman's research. She was pointing out the fact that they never looked at social or environmental reasons why this deficit could be, considering they moved a lot of indigenous populations onto reservations. They were giving them less dense nutritional foods, a lot of processed foods when they were used to living off of the land. And so instead, they were kind of using omic science, which was focused on these so-called biological or genetic factors without taking in that whole expanse of impacts that could be causing that. They were just singling it out to those two specific things. We find this happen to a lot of diabetics in terms of how they're treated by medical professionals, considering a lot of times you could come in with other consequences and people are just going to distill it to, it's just diabetes. You don't have to think about the fact that there could be other things happening to you. So that really resonated with me from a researcher perspective. As an overall conclusion to my project, I have found that filmmakers have failed to encapsulate diabetes and diabetics' lived experiences. As a screenwriter and film critical studies person, my goal is to never replicate any of these misconceptions in my own works, and when I'm going into a creative project, to understand the negative representations and misconceptions that face marginalized people groups and not replicate those. Integrating screenwriting and film critical studies in a lot of ways, I think, can give you a lot of understanding as to how those negative representations affect individuals and make you have a more academic perspective to your creative works. On that note, considering I focus mostly on film critical studies, I have written a script about my own diagnosis story and hope to produce and publish that short film on this channel, so that way you can follow along with my experiences. I also hope to look into diabetes and how it is represented in other films, be it through blog posts necessarily or on this channel continuing. So follow along, whatever happens.